They want to tend the body. They want to see and touch it. They want to minister in their own way as their last act of love and respect for Jesus. And so the three women arrive at the tomb of Jesus while it is still dark. As they walk to the tomb, they carry the weight of their anger, their fear, and their grief, along with the spices to anoint and prepare Jesus' body for burial. For these women, seeing the body matters. This body of Jesus in particular matters to them. This body taught them, ministered to so many, healed the sick, welcomed the outcast, spoke out for the oppressed. This body of Jesus, whom they loved with all their heart. They need to touch his hands and his feet and clean those awful wounds and say their final goodbyes. It's not just a religious or a social custom that's relegated to women. We learn that it's much more than a ritual on that first Easter. It becomes an act of love and discipleship, which is why we remember and tell that story some 2,000 years later. Caring for a body after death is something we still do, and something that still matters to us. When someone dies, we want to see them one more time. We want to touch them one more time. We want to honor our loved ones and prepare a respectful and dignified burial. It's normal and it's natural, despite our society's tendency to sanitize death into something that's to be feared or avoided. We have a natural need to provide an act of love and care to those we love. So as we gather on this Easter, I know there are many among us who are walking and identifying with those women, walking in the darkness of our own grief, remembering loved ones who died, and we were unable to have one last look, one last touch, one last moment. We missed the last handshake or hug, and one last glimpse and touch of our loved one after they died. This pandemic has robbed us of so much. School celebrations, family dinners, and we grieve those losses. But one of the cruelties of the pandemic is how this disease has separated us from our loved ones and prevented us from those rituals that help us to remember and give thanks for their life. We've left our loved ones at the door of the emergency room or as the ambulance pulls away, and we watch them get carried off into another's care. We've been knocking on the windows of nursing homes, hoping to glimpse just a bit of someone that we love that we could not visit. Even when we're visiting with someone through the iPad or a computer screen, and I'm so glad we were even able to do that. Didn't many of us hold our hands up to the screen just as a symbolic action, like maybe you can feel my touch through that screen? We have missed seeing each other. And I know we needed to practice those precautions because the disease was passing so quickly, especially among older members of our family and our friends. And sometimes those last moments of life were delegated to bodies that were not our family. Those last moments of our loved one's life were given over to the care of nurses and doctors and chaplains and first responders who became the bodies for us. They embodied the care that we so desperately wanted to give to our loved ones. They were our hands, our words, our prayers as our loved ones were sick or lay dying. They, like the women who went to the tomb that morning, were carrying out some responsibilities as they promised to become those nurses and doctors and chaplains and medics and administrators of hospitals and long-term facilities. They carried the weight of keeping people safe, not only in their heads, but carried that weight in their bodies, and so many of them are carrying the weight of that grief to this day. Now that we're able to see one another again when vaccinated, and grandparents are so excited to hug their grandchildren again, we recognize the power of touch and the power of physical presence that we've missed so much. Those of you who are teachers, I know how scared it was to go back in the classroom, but for a year you've been saying how hard it is to teach without the physical presence of those kids in front of you. I can tell you what it was like last Easter without the physical presence of more than 10 of us in this room. I know in my head I said, okay, you're all out there, but there was something about the bodily presence of being with one another. The presence of us gathered here in worship has been a reminder of how much energy we receive from bodies when we gather. And I'm so grateful for all the technologies and all the platforms that kept us connected over the past year, but I can tell you there is just something so different, at least for me, of being present with someone. There is power in the embodied community of Christ. The women walk with the heaviness of grief and worry about who's going to roll away that large stone in front of the tomb. And then when they get to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, they encounter this angel who tells them not to be afraid. And when someone tells you not to be afraid, I mean, how does that go over with you? Really? You know, as soon as someone tells you don't be afraid, you're afraid. Don't be afraid. Go look for Jesus of Nazareth who's crucified. He's been raised. He's not here. Well, they can see that. His body is not here. But the angel says, go, go. Jesus has gone ahead, and the disciples will see him. You will see him. So they fled in amazement and terror, and they didn't tell anyone. Who wants to believe in a bodily presence? Mark's version of Easter ends right there with fear and amazement. The other Gospels have other versions of what happened that first Easter, and there's even some verses added to Mark, maybe to match the other stories, but let's go back to how it really ends. It's an abrupt ending. Fear and terror, amazement were with those women on that first Easter. And it seems to me this ending is the perfect ending, the most fitting ending for Easter 2 during this pandemic. It is difficult to hold on to a belief in resurrection hope when the Friday world is all around us, and I don't need to list all the Friday experiences we're having. But even so, Easter made Black Friday into Good Friday, and now resurrection triumph is clear. So we gather in that hope. Friday did not have the last word for Jesus, and the Friday realities which darken our world will not have the last word either. Jesus transformed the brutality of the empire that beat him and killed him by remaining true to his belief that God would make all things new, that all bodies are loved by God. We see in Jesus how he lived through Friday with his body, experiencing sorrow like we do, failure like we do, loss like we do, betrayal by friends like we experience, questioning whether God is really with him, just like we do. We gather because Jesus' resurrection reminds us that the power of evil will never have the last word. We gather to remember those women who first came to the tomb and the disciples after that who experienced the living Christ. They felt his presence. They saw his body. They touched him again. They heard his voice say, "Shalom, peace." And despite their fear, they went on. And they embodied all that Jesus taught them. All that Jesus taught them about hope and life. They went to touch Jesus, but instead the risen Christ ended up touching them. Is that not the message for us this Easter? Can we allow our whole selves to be healed by the touch of the risen Christ who can make all things new? Can we open ourselves, our whole bodies, to the good news that new life is possible? Can we be amazed at the power of new life that we see all around us? Can we dare to believe that new life is possible? Can we be witnesses of that story? Can we embody that story of hope and new life to one another and to all whom we meet? Can we give glory to the one who touched our hearts and leads us and invites us to follow him? May it be so on this Easter day and in the days to follow. Thanks be to God. Amen.